Yes, thank you, Sonia. So it's my pleasure to chair this last roundtable on the socioeconomic implications of the pandemic with three participants. So Sylvia Welby is professor of sociology and director of the Violence and Society Center at City University of London. Albena Asmanova is Associate Professor of Political and Social Thought at the University of Kent's Brussels School of International Studies. And Sonia Alveas is a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Faculty of Economics, Belgrade University, and Associate Researcher at LIEP. So I'll directly hand the floor to Sylvia Welby, and thanks a lot in advance for keeping the time.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Gerard, and everybody for organising this amazing international symposium on COVID. COVID is terrible for society and brilliant for social theory. So, what are those debates in social theory, and how are they being restructured as a consequence of having to meet the challenge of COVID? And what are their implications for how we theorise crisis and begin to take crisis more seriously as an endemic feature of society that we need to be able to theorise? The early debates on COVID tended to set up a distinction between liberalism and authoritarianism, drawing on Foucauldian understandings as if the attempts to deal with COVID should be interpreted as restrictions on human freedom, and that these were forms of authoritarianism. Many of the early debates on the theorization, especially those led by Agamben, who many people followed, gave us this debate between liberalism and authoritarianism. This, I think, is most unfortunate, and that there is a second debate, a second axis to debate, which is much more significant in understanding the debates on COVID and its effects on society. That is the debate between understanding social democracy and neoliberalism. The first debate omits social democracy and hence has no conceptual place for the public health intervention which has been so important in any kind of effective intervention against COVID. Public health is best understood as a practical form of social democracy. Its underlying philosophy and practice is that if one is sick, we are all sick. It's an understanding of collectivity, interconnectivity, of the significance of state action, of the importance of science, and the importance of all of these things coming together to stop issues such as COVID becoming catastrophic. The other to social democracy is neoliberalism. And we have seen in many places, not a social democratic response, but we have seen the outsourcing of the things which are needed into failing systems of track and trace, failed global supply chains for personal protective equipment, and a series of attempts to restructure the economy by the state in order to create new markets, new practices for profit extraction in the heart of the COVID crisis. So I would have set the debate up between the kinds of social theories which would help us to understand this contestation between two societal models of social democracy and neoliberalism. That will be the axis on which I would have preferred to have constituted the debate, rather than the one between liberalism and authoritarianism, for all that has some resonance in some nuanced contexts. I want to position these debates in the context of a theory of crisis. The early theories of crisis were simply whether or not the powers of the state would be picked up and used to access the state of exception. I think that's an insufficient theory of crisis, and that sociology, social science, should be thinking more thoroughly about a theory of crisis, since after all, these are endemic features of social history. Elsewhere, I've theorised crisis in a book on crisis, which drew as its main example on the financial crisis. And my thinking on COVID was, what would I learn from COVID? Would it make me change my mind on my theory of crisis? Was it any different? So the theory of crisis that I've been developing has been built upon complexity theory. That is the assumption that small changes can give rise to very large changes. That change is non-linear, not linear, it's not proportionate, and that we need to understand positive feedback loops as well as negative ones, that is, that things can be exacerbated rather than stabilized. And in the context of that complex systems theorization of crisis, I suggested that there were 4 different potential outcomes. There could be recuperation, that is, it was a blip. Horrid, terrible, millions die, and society goes back to where it was. There are lots of forms of crisis which take exactly that form. Small ones are economic bubbles. This is a really large one. It could just go back to exactly where it was before. The second outcome is intensification of the existing social practices. An intensification of neoliberalism, the strengthening of those forces towards neoliberalism, and in those few countries which ran a social democratic response, an intensification of the success, the visibility of a social democratic response. The third outcome is transformation. That is, we have a tipping point in the path of development and a major and significant transformation, for example, away from a neoliberal towards a social democratic transformation, if there were to be an understanding that this was a catastrophic form of development and that only a major political shift in which major political forces would restructure, form new coalitions, and which there would be a new form of political practice which could lead to transformation. Some people still think that that one is possible. A fourth one, of course, is simply catastrophe. Whole societies have previously been wiped out by the plague. There is no reason why that should not recur. That is, catastrophe is still possible. Those new variants could still come back and mean that the vaccines which have been developed are insufficient. There still could be catastrophe. Of course, one could say that the millions dead already constitute that catastrophe, but of course, millions more could still die. So what I'm suggesting here is that we need to develop our forms of social theorizing to think about these social processes. We need to think about these alternative societal forms. There are major ways of thinking about alternative societal forms, and I'm suggesting that we should not forget the social democratic model, which lies behind the public health initiatives which have come to the fore so significantly, which are so significantly challenged by some of the neoliberal restructurings of some of the supply chains. And that the balance of these forces is significant in thinking about which is the outcome of the crisis. The crisis isn't over. It has not yet cascaded into the economic in the way that it will do. We are merely at the first end of this crisis with the COVID causing deaths in relationship to disease. The full impact of the COVID crisis will be its impact upon the economy, which will cascade into the decision-making on the fiscal, whether there's austerity again or not. It will cascade still further about whether this exacerbates civil societal divisions. Will this exacerbate the ethno-nationalism? We have seen the rise of nationalism. We've even seen it in COVID nationalism. Will we see further deglobalization and the rise of extreme social movements which build upon ethno-national foundations? Will this lead to further violence? Will this ultimately lead to a cascade into, yet again, large-scale social death, genocide, and war? Is this exactly like 100 years ago, when the financial crisis gave rise to fascism and Holocaust? Is the scale of the COVID crisis the same kind of scale that we saw with the financial crisis of the 1920s? Or are we so different? Is the depth of civil society, the forms of democratization that we have, so strong that the cascade of that crisis will not occur? It will not tip from one of those domains to another. It might not. I think the outcome is unclear, and I think the development of social theory will help us think through and participate in those processes as they develop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. And I will now give the floor to Albena Azmanova.
Thank you. My chapter deals with conflicting grievances about suffered injustice and the agendas of progressive politics that are taking shape. The chapter is titled Battlegrounds of Justice, the Pandemic, and What Really Grieves the 99%. Now, the indignation with rising economic inequalities was already high when the pandemic hit. Usually, pandemics have an equalizing effect as surplus wealth is destroyed. However, this pandemic, in fact, exacerbated existing inequalities and made them more visible. As low-skill manual laborers lost their jobs, or if they were deemed essential workers, their lives became more endangered. And so the struggle against inequalities has become the centerpiece of progressive politics of our time. As the neoliberal agenda is now in retreat, there is a great appetite for a return to the growth and redistribution formula that ensured the inclusive prosperity of the post-war welfare state. There is this interest both from the center
Albena, I'm sorry, I have a sound issue. I'm not sure if I'm the only one.
Sorry?
Yeah, we can't hear you. You just blocked a couple of seconds.
You cannot hear me at all?
Yes, now yes.
Now it's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so where did you lose me?
Just like 10, 15 seconds ago.
Okay, so I was saying that now there is a hunger for a return to the inclusive prosperity of the post-war welfare state, for the old truths of social democracy, right? But this is a very unfortunate development, I claim in this chapter, because that prosperity of the past came at a very high environmental cost. So we need a novel solution if we're serious about making social justice compatible with environmental justice. And that solution will emerge, I propose, from a different diagnosis of the nature of the social crisis that is at the root of the pandemic, at the root of the fact that a contamination with a pathogen transformed into a major socioeconomic disaster in the most affluent and scientifically savvy states of the world. Now, hopefully, the pandemic has also made clear that quite apart from inequality, our societies have been afflicted for a very long time by what I call in my new book, Capitalism on Age, a pandemic of precarity, of massive economic and social insecurity that is experienced not only by the poor, the underprivileged, by what a guy standing called the precariat, but also by the rich, by the highly skilled laborers, by basically all. Precarity, I suggest, is the affliction of the 99%. It is the social question of our time. Now, this fragility of our societies is the result of their exposure to the competitive pressures of global integrated capitalism, which has entailed, on the one hand, the depletion of the commons with the cuts to the public sector in order to make these economies more agile and more competitive in the world, and to decreasing of the employment security or decreasing of the security of individual livelihoods. And think about it. no matter how equal we might make our societies through redistribution, through growth and redistribution, this fragility will persist if we do not strengthen the commons and if we do not strengthen individual livelihoods. But if we focus on fighting precarity rather than fighting inequality, and especially on fighting the roots of that precarity, which is the competitive pursuit of profit, which is the main constitutive principle of capitalism, this will solve the tension between environmental justice and social justice, because we will not need the growth and redistribution formula. We will focus on stable livelihoods, not on affluence. And might even, as I claim in my recent writing, this reshifting of policy approach might even trigger a radical social transformation away from capitalism without the need for a terminal crisis of capitalism, revolutionary break, or a socialist utopia. This is what my chapter is about.
Thank you so much, Albina. And now the last but not least presentation by Sonia Alvias.
Thank you very much, Anne. Okay, so without further ado, I'll just move on to, so my chapter really echoes the Sylvia's and the Albina's as well, because it focuses on these ideas of security and safety in today's society, and also inequality and human dignity. And I start off by sort of counteracting this very popular claim that the coronavirus pandemic has put capitalism on hold, right? And everybody has been talking about capitalism being on hold, the state being back in, and then Marxists would be sort of celebrating this prospect, while the libertarians or the more liberal thinkers would be warning about the threat of political authoritarianism and everything associated with it. But what I do instead is I suggest that we shouldn't really be surprised by state intervention into the pandemic or state reactions to the pandemic more generally. And then I go on further to explain that state intervention is really an inherent feature of capitalism. And this is especially so in the crisis, right? So in other words, I'm saying that responses to COVID-19 have not really departed from how capitalism or the capitalist system has historically reacted to crises. And of course, like the magnitude of the crisis then would determine the level of the involvement. But then, of course, even beyond the crisis, there's really no capitalism without the state, which manages its risks and allows it to adapt to exogenous shocks and be able to survive the crisis. So of course, we have numerous examples of the state supporting companies, serving to like de-risk the market exposure and market uncertainty for certain companies. We can think of the famous examples of American government and military investment into the Silicon Valley, and then maybe like the too big to fail banks in the 2008 crisis. But government always intervenes to support capitalism, right, and the capitalist agents. And then also, of course, the state supports workers, but then we could also argue that like this also is support for employers, because by providing welfare and skills to workers, you're allowing them to be more productive for the employers as well. And this is especially the case in the knowledge economy. So this first part of the chapter really suggests that the management of real life uncertainty is a key concern for all agents of capitalism. And whether this is farmers, workers, politicians, capitalists, everybody wants to sort of try and escape insecurity as much as possible, and especially in the affluent society where you have even more to lose, right? Than you, like if a crisis hits you. So, and when it's out of your control, when it's not because you're not able to run your business or because you've been taking unnecessary risks. So, and this pandemic is one such example. So the intention of this sort of first part is I want to dispel this myth that we have these able participants of the competitive society and that they don't somehow need security and protection from the market forces, but then we have these anti-capitalist forces which are saved for those who are not able to make it in the competitive society, whether for the lack of ability or discrimination or whatever the reason. Because this almost sounds like it's out of justice and empathy, and for whatever reason, we are then like saving this security for those people who are not able to compete. But this is really a hypocritical illusion because it's very far from the reality of how our capitalist societies actually operate today, right? Because as I said, all agents need some form of security. And But of course, the catch being here is that we don't all have the same access to security, because another prominent feature of capitalism that Albena was just talking about is inequality, right? Especially in this globalized era, we've seen an increase in inequality. And so some people have more opportunity and resources to protect themselves than others, or like much more opportunity. And then also not everybody has equal access to state resources. So to me, the important question is not whether the state should be providing security or not, but how, like who gets this security and how this political economy of state intervention and redistribution works in times of pandemics or other crises. And of course, while there's variety between the different countries, we can also say that, that generally the economic and welfare policies in Western Europe, for example, are status preserving. They are inclined to support those who are too big to fail, for example, at the expense of maybe smaller or newer companies. They're skewed towards the elderly at the expense of youth in terms of like welfare state expenditures, or like even just the demographics of it. And then like they're skewed towards labor market insiders versus those who are in less stable employment. And then, so basically, and what we see in this pandemic is that these existing or pre-existing socioeconomic and intergenerational inequalities have really determined the distributive profile of how the pandemic and the state interventions that are related to it have then affected this distribution. And then I show some data also to back up these claims. And then apart from discussing this unequal access to state security, I also introduced the issue of social reproduction, which is extremely important in any crisis, but then particularly important in this public health related one. Because apart from the role of the state, another de-risker which makes capitalist production possible is really the often ignored daily labor, which is usually generational, gendered, and racialized, and it takes place in households, in schools, in hospitals. And the role of social reproduction really becomes especially pertinent in crisis because individuals and households fall back to these personal and communal resources in order to survive the times of the downturn, right? Like whether economic or social. And then because in this pandemic, the state and even the private sector has completely withdrawn from the provision of care services, this effect of the social reproduction burden has been even more pronounced, which is why we see a lot of discussions on the crisis of care recently. And then, of course, most importantly, these traditionally marginalized groups are also disproportionately burdened by this social reproduction responsibilities. This goes even beyond the sort of gendered household chores. It is the issue of migrant domestic workers. It is the issue of underpaid essential workers who are providing services like to us, such as providing food, feeding us, picking our fruits and vegetables, healing us, educating us, even entertaining us through the arts, perhaps, because, right, like we read books and watch films and stay at home safe from the virus. But then what I do in the end, to conclude this chapter, is I bring together all these different sectors, and then I argue that these layers of exclusion, which are gendered and racialized, I repeat, they intersect, and then they are the ones that are creating not only the structure of the distribution of the impacts of this pandemic, but they're also producing something that I refer to the intersectional counter movement, which is really what I mean is by like a lot of the protests and the complaints that we see against the status quo that we see in the distribution of security and resources in model capitalism. So to conclude, I would just I end up by saying we shouldn't be surprised by this social pushback, with such as like the Black Lives Matter movement or associated movements, but we don't know whether these challenges to the status quo will be leading us to a more just and equal post-pandemic world. Like Sylvia was saying, this is one of the scenarios, or we could perhaps succumb to further social polarization and conflict. But what I do argue, and this is sort of I think the point of my chapter really, is that in order to find an answer to this question, we really need to pay more attention to these gendered and racialized intersectional aspects of the crisis, but also the interdependency and how this inequality makes the pandemic harder to contain. So I'm emphasizing that these issues are extremely important in order for the pandemic to make more sense to all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sonia. Many thanks to all the presenters for their keeping the time so well. So this leaves us with about 15 minutes of discussion, and maybe I'll just say a few words of introduction just to let people take the time to reflect on the questions they may have to ask. So
Excuse me.
In the chat.
Can I just jump in before,
sure.
before you ask the, just mentioning the last three authors of the chapter that were not able to be present today, and this is Klaus Offe, Brian Turner, and Donatella Della Porta. So they also contributed chapters to this volume, and you can find them like reading the book, but they were not able to join us today. So I just wanted to bring that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I also wanted to mention that the book is also available online. So it's probably through institutional access. But for example, if you have a Sciences Po access, I was scrolling through the chapters that we were talking, and so you can access the chapters also online. So this is a very impressive volume. I think this shows the. I'm really impressed by the capacity of social scientists in this major crisis that we're all facing to reflect critically on and to react based on the social science theories and knowledge, and really reflect on what is at stake in this crisis. And I think at a time when social science is under harsh critique, this says something very positive about our capacity to speak truth to power in the most positive sense of the term. The different chapters really show how the crisis is not just a health crisis, but also a crisis that functions as a sort of a leverage to reveal previous social and political dynamics, and it increases the salience of issues of inequality and social justice, environmental justice, the relations between humans and the machines they have created, and generally various forms of power mechanisms. And getting back to the question Gerard was initially raising regarding rupture or continuity, the general tone I felt in your presentations was that of acceleration, which might be somewhere in between rupture and continuity. So I don't know if this is of relevance, but it seems that in many areas the crisis accelerates previous social dynamics that it then reveals. Anyway, the discussion can go into many directions. So I don't know if there are also the presenters you can also react or respond to each other. This is also an occasion for you to exchange. I don't know if there are any questions or reactions that you want to raise. So Olivier Boraz has a question regarding how far can we associate various effects of the pandemic on social structures, inequalities, political system to the virus itself, as opposed to the political responses taken to fight the virus. So how do we differentiate the effects of the virus itself as opposed to the effect of public policies targeting the virus? I think this is a very relevant question. So any of you want to take on this, comment on this? Yeah, Gerard, go ahead.
Unmute myself. Yeah, that's of course an absolutely interesting and important question. It requires, to answer it properly, some conceptualization about the nature of causation, and I certainly can't do that at this particular moment, but definitely this question needs to be answered, and I suppose a short answer might be that the virus that caused the pandemic, we already have two causes there, the virus and the pandemic anyway, whether the virus, whether COVID-19 or the virus that caused COVID-19, the disease, is a major cause or some kind of a trigger. So I suppose, I think, again, maybe it depends on your overall conceptualization of the whole situation, but I suppose I would tend to see it as a trigger of some kind. because I think the really key thing, which I tried to mention in the beginning of my contribution and also in the chapter I wrote, but it needs to be much more developed, is that the health crisis, however you want to describe it, interacts with other crises, in especially the environmental one, the economic one, and the political one in relation to democracy. So one would have to, I think, conceptualize it in relation to all these levels, and then one has to bring in agency and the whole dimension of the social construction of the of the situation. Yeah, so it's not a given that the virus caused the present situation, but a great deal of conceptualization is needed to really answer this question properly. But others might have a view on that. There's a great article to be written, if not a book, to answer this question. You know, what caused the French Revolution, for example.
I wanted to just stress on the occasion that Olivier Borras has, I just realized that he sent his question in private, I think, to me, so I wanted to identify him as the person who has the question, and he's also a co-author of a book on the French response to the crisis, which I'll put the link in the chat for everybody to see. So anybody wants to jump in on this question or other elements that you want to raise? Yes, Sonia? Do you know?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in just to ask the question to perhaps maybe this is for the first roundtable or the first panel on the data-driven pandemic and the technocracy. Because and it's hard to remember who mentioned this first, but this idea that like science, right, thrives on conflict and on sort of discussions about what there's not one truth, right? It's about debate, it's about figuring out what the majority is for, but then somehow we do get in public this presentation of like science is the truth, listen to the science. And then how the politicians translate it. So I'm wondering to what extent we can talk about the hegemony of scientific discourses, right? Between like whether certain scientific discourses are dominating other ones, and like what you might think about this as an idea. Is it the medical or I don't know.
Well, can I respond to that? I think it's almost the opposite problem, in that the system is set up in such a way as to produce consensus. So, for example, Anthony Fauci, who is the spokesman in the American context, is the most powerful figure in giving grants for thousands and thousands of researchers. So nobody's going to contradict him. He has this indirect authority, and the agencies involved also work very hard to generate consensus statements. So the interesting thing in this crisis is they did such a bad job of it that they discredited themselves. So nobody believes anything he says. He contradicts himself one day after another. And so this is really an issue for the credibility of science. And it's a hole that they have dug themselves that they're not going to get out of very easily, because the level of skepticism is much higher than it was when this began.
Maybe in the same vein regarding the types of expertise mobilized, I was struck in the case of France by the complex interplay between medical expertise and public health, which is actually less present as a general policy perspective. And did you have any input on this? Like, especially, I'm struck by the absence of community-based policies in terms of prevention, which is something that maybe we should have learned from other pandemics, and notably HIV, and that it's striking the current handling of the crisis, at least in France. So, and I think it has to do partly with the interplay, the role of public health as opposed to more classic medical science. But I don't know if it's the same in other countries or if you have inputs on this. No, or not. Actually, there's a question in the chat that, well, maybe so. Oh,
look, this is because, you know, there is a science, but there is a very complex system of decision making, which is, you know, run by not nation state, but on various levels. You see, in Italy, the regional authority is largely responsible for health. And you have, you know, this three-level game between European decision-making, national and regional. And all of those levels have politicians and scientists there. And the process is ever more complicated with various interpretations of scientific evidence take on their own life, so to speak, in the bargaining process, which is these days mostly conducted on TV screens and on the internet, which basically makes a mockery of deliberative decision making, right? And this is where we are, so to speak, you know, and the selective transparency of various data and decisions made is a major problem. You know, take the transparency or lack of it of the European Commission's negotiating purchase of vaccinations, right? Which was basically raised by Socialist Party in the European Parliament, showing this page of agreement totally in black, you know. In the situation like this, the issue what is truth is becoming very fuzzy, so to speak, right? And I totally agree with Stephen Turner when he said that a lot of those who speak on behalf of science represent simply medical administrative establishment, right? With vested interests inside. And we cannot escape from this. This is a complex government we lived in, which is not only kind of making decisions on. It's not like this that we have a social contract, you know, and we know how to give a mandate to the government to make enlightened decisions on our behalf. This is for the birds, so to speak, in the modern world. And we don't have even, you know, there's no way you can reduce the chaos emerging from it. But what is more important is to understand the chaos. Yeah, I know that Sylvia plays around with this sociology, you know, the theory of chaos in sociology, something what economists started earlier. But this is the only way to do for us as social scientists and not medical scientists.
Thank you. So there is another comment, a question in the chat by Sam Webster regarding, so it's a neo-Durkheimian question regarding the nature and normativity within a group. Sexual social interaction is highly significant, not least in transmission of virus. How do we have a grasp of this? So I don't know if anyone wants to react on this?
Well, let me just say something about this. I think this has really got to be studied because it's really fascinating. There's a lot of public discussion of shaming, rebelling against shaming, and all of the sort of micro interactions that have to do with masking and behavior in the face of the virus, who's ignoring it, the different kinds of practices that people individually construct for themselves in relation to other people, in relation to objects. And I think this is actually part and parcel also of the problem with the epidemiology of it, because we don't really know what people are doing. And that is how the thing transmits. So we have this very high level knowledge, and there's all this stuff going on at the micro level that's really determining things that we're completely blank about. And it's very difficult to study, and it's not the kind of thing that's studied by big laboratories with the fancy equipment. So science policy is really not interested in that. And so this is a hole in our expertise that's a very big and important hole.
Yes, absolutely. I think it relates to my comment about how like community-based public health got lost in the way, because they an approach that takes the actual interactions and the actual risks that people want to take as a starting point. And as opposed to such a bottom-up approach, we have very top-down approaches based indeed on very macro level data and very abstract assumptions regarding what people do or want to do. Or yes, so there is indeed a very interesting discussion to be had around types of expertise and how sociology could bring into the discussion. All right, so I don't know if anybody else has any questions to raise. There's nothing left in the chat, and we're actually running out of time. So, well, maybe it's time to thank all the participants for these great roundtables. And so again, I hope this will have motivated you to read the book if you haven't yet. And thank you very much for participating. Sonia, do you want to have a last word maybe?
Sure. Thank you, Anne, very much for chairing this event. And thank you, everybody, for showing up and giving very interesting talks. And I'll just end there, so I don't want to take too much time. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.